Good morning. Lots of familiar faces on this screen. As Maria said, my name's Yasmin Allen, Chairman of Advance.org, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to Advance's Global Digital Roundtable with Dr. Genevieve Bell. Honoured guests, colleagues and friends, I'd like to thank you for joining us today from Australia, Japan, the United Kingdom and the US for what will be a fascinating discussion on the impact of technology and new ways of thinking about innovation. We're delighted to present this discussion with the support of our partner, Gilbert and Tobin. I pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island elders past, present and future. Advance identifies and celebrates extraordinary Australians living and working overseas, and also our returned expats. Our guest of honour today epitomises excellence, success and giving back to her country after 30 years offshore, 20 of them in Silicon Valley. Dr. Bell is a special friend of Advance, and Genevieve, we really appreciate your time today as Advance continues to open the opportunity for our diaspora to share their knowledge back home for the benefit of all Australians. COVID-19 started as a health crisis and is clearly now an economic crisis of major proportions. The solutions are unprecedented and strategies being developed on the fly as the health crisis weaves and returns. I sit on the boards across Australia's major sectors of health, finance and energy, ASX, Cochlear and Santos, and all these companies are currently working remotely and facing into the challenges of how to kickstart growth. COVID-19 has slingshotted us into a future world, one in which digital has become central to every interaction, forcing both organisations and individuals faster up the adoption curve. More than ever, technology is critical to everything we do, from remote working to providing fast information to support vaccine development. Advance patron and our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, recently announced a $1.5 billion investment into nationwide reform of our skills sector to help drive our economic recovery. The Australian government is prepared to invest in the skills that are aligned to industry needs and jobs of the future. I'm part of this as chairman of the Digital Skills Organisation, set up through the Department of Employment, effectively a new partnership between industry, government and education. The imperative is for us to transition our workforces to ensure we have the talent required for Australia to thrive in today's future world. Dr. Genevieve Bell's work provides an important contribution, making sure we retain the human element and using social science as a guide to not only understanding but shaping our future. Last year, I was at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas. Unfortunately, no travel for me this year. And the discussions there were focused very much on the impact of AI. If AI means we are going to be able to make rapid decisions at scale, then we better ensure that we have really good decision-making skills. This is the type of ethical dilemma that I hope Genevieve's 3A Institute at ANU can help solve for us. So in a moment, I'll introduce Dr. Genevieve Bell. Maria McNamara, our Advance CEO, will then facilitate a Q&A, followed by the vote of thanks from our hosts today, Gilbert and Tobin. As always, we'll close the session on time by 10 a.m. Australian time. So, distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell, AO, is the 2016 Advance Global Australian Award winner and the Advanced Technology Innovation Award winner. Genevieve is a cultural anthropologist, technologist and futurist, with her research focused on the intersection of cultural practices and technology, bringing the human perspective into artificial intelligence and the next generation of cyber-physical systems. Genevieve is founder and director at the 3A Institute at ANU, established with the mission of building a new applied science to effectively and ethically manage the impact of artificial intelligence. Big job. She holds a PhD in anthropology from Stanford University, has published over 30 journal articles and registered 12 patents. Genevieve is also Vice President and Senior Fellow at Intel and an independent non-executive director at CBA. Genevieve is an innate storyteller. She helps people understand the relationship between humans and computers, while also asking the difficult questions which ensure that the best of humanity will be reflected in tomorrow's technology. Please welcome Distinguished Professor Dr. Genevieve Bell.
Thank you. Thank you, Yasmin. That may explain why I feel a little bit tired when I listen to that set of tasks I have. Also explains why there's no time in the day. I'm incredibly grateful to be here. I think about Advance's work often, and I'm acutely aware in some ways that I ended up back in Australia because of Advance and the connections that it made for me. And certainly my first year back home again was much easier because of it. So I too want to pay my respects to the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people on whose lands I'm sitting today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and recognize that I sit on land that was never ceded and will always be sacred. And for me, there is something incredibly special about getting to say those things again. 30 years in America left me acutely aware that we never acknowledged whose country we were on there when we could have. And these days, when I go back to Silicon Valley, I pay my respects and call the names of the Alawan people on whose country I'm usually standing when I'm there. For me, starting by talking about the country that I'm on is also really important when you're talking about next generation technical systems, because we have the extraordinary advantage of being in a country and in a place where people have been building technical systems actually for longer than anywhere else on the planet. 2 years ago now, I went to Bawarrina, a town I suspect some of you are familiar with, that is on the New South Wales-Queensland border on the Barwon River, a town where recently the rivers ran again for the first time in 4 years. In Bawarrina, there are a set of fish traps. They extend, at this point, less than a kilometre. They once were nearly 2 kilometres long. They are a set of rock formations in the river that are designed to catch fish as they go both up and down that waterway and store them in cool running water in order to basically create deep storage. And the reason for doing that was that the Barwon at that particular place is a meeting ground of multiple different language groups who come together in that one place. And that set of fish weirs were built and then rebuilt and built again over multiple generations in order to allow people to gather in that place to have social, religious, and human moments. The most extraordinary thing about that system for me is that archaeologists believe it was probably built 40,000 years ago, which means it is the single oldest technical system built by humans on the planet. And history tells us that the last time it was used was about 1917. So it is genuinely remarkable to think about a technical system that has a 40,000 year span. And for me, when I think about what it means both to talk about the future and to talk about building new technical systems, I'm acutely aware that I get to do it in a place that has been doing that longer than anywhere else on the planet. And that has been doing it with an eye to, for me, what are core values? Sustainability. So a system that lasts 40,000 years is kind of epitomizes the notion of sustainability. One that was safe. It was a system that maintained itself, that was designed to sit inside that landscape, that didn't ever get bigger than that landscape could manage. And it was a responsible system because it was a system that actually did as intended and no more and no less. It made it possible for humans to gather. It created systems by which humans could share, care, and take care of each other and also take care of country. And for me, those attributes, sustainable, safe, responsible, are the kind of attributes I think about when I think about next generation technical systems. So Yasmin told you a little bit about my biography. Here are the other kind of important pieces of that when I think about what the most reasonable and responsible approaches are both to technical systems and to innovation. You need to know a couple of things. I'm not only an anthropologist, I'm a child of an anthropologist. So I grew up on my mother's field sites in central and northern Australia in the 1970s and 1980s. I spent most of my childhood living on Walpurgis settlements between Alice and Tennant Creek, in places where people still remembered their first sight of Europeans, their first sight of cattle and fences, not always in that order, and who, when I was a little girl, took me onto their country and told me its stories. And so much of my childhood was spent without shoes, speaking Walpurgis, and killing things. Effectively, hashtag best childhood ever. Means, I know what to do with a goanna when I see it. The answer is eat it almost at once, although there's some preparation involved first, probably should kill it. It also means whenever I say that in the United States, that people think I might be a serial killer, at least a budding one. But the answer is I grew up with people who were on country and who told me the stories about being in that country. And it is safe to say that journey in that place and my journey back from that place to Canberra shaped me permanently. There's something about coming from living with people on country to coming back to the very, very white and very, very parochial suburbs of Canberra, and having a high school teacher explain to me that Captain Cook had discovered Australia, which seemed to me to be implausible as there were already people here. And his explanation that, well, those people hadn't told anyone, so it didn't count, landed me on detention in a manner that was so spectacular that I suspect he still remembers it, as I certainly do. And it made very clear to me at that point that not all stories had the same currency, and that there were different ways of thinking about what it meant to be here and be an Australian. My mother, at that moment in time, sat me down and explained to both my brother and I that the world as we found it wasn't necessarily the world that it should be, and that we were morally obligated in her minds to make the world a better place, and not for ourselves, but for others. And that the characteristic of that world would be one that was fair and just. And in her mind, you then had to put all of your effort, your time, your intellectual energy, your passion, pretty much everything on the line. She was willing to imagine that might include your life if it was necessary, in order to make the world different than the one we found it in. It's a pretty heavy message for a small child, but it's one that I'd like to think has shaped the decisions I've made ever since. It's certainly a North Star that carried me to the United States. It helped me make a series of decisions in my career about what I was going to do and what I wasn't. It took me to Stanford, but it also took me out of Stanford in a time when I think having a tenure track job in a large American university was the best that anthropologists like me could hope for. I took a risk and joined Intel. I've now spent 22 years at Intel in various capacities, and I learned a lot of lessons there, but I also learned the incredible importance of asking questions, and not just accepting technical solutions, but asking who designed that and what was the world you thought you were building if it was used, and is that really a world that everyone should be in? And I think for many of my Intel colleagues, I was an endless irritation. I think some of them would regard me as a complete pain in the ass. And I'm fairly certain the review I once got from the chairman of Ericsson Siemens, which was, Dr. Bell, you asked many questions and answered very few, is for me a treasured review, and for him was a stinging rebuke. And so there's always been that kind of disconnect, right? Many of you on the call know I came home now 3.5 years ago. I came home at the request of the Vice Chancellor of the Australian National University. Little did he know, because that wasn't a story he was connected to, that the very first Vice Chancellor of the Australian National University, Nugget Coombs, had been a frequent diner at my mother's dining room table. And so I had grown up listening to Nugget talking about building the university back in the 1940s and 1950s. And so I know there was a moment in time when Nugget took a briefcase with letters and money around the world and tracked down the men who became known as the Seven Dwarfs, who started the university, and he would sit next to them on benches in cities like LA and London and turn to men whose names are household names and say, it's time to come home. And Mark Oliphant answered the call, and so did Crawford and a whole bunch of other people. And, we started the Australian National University. Brian told me it was time to come home and had no idea when he said that all I could hear in my head was Nugget Coombs. And it's hard to say no to Nugget. And so I came home. Part of the reason for doing that was to build something new. I was really clear that what Silicon Valley had offered me was an ability to work at scale and exposure to the most extraordinary technical systems you will ever see, and people who were willing to lean in, go hard, build things and break things. All that language you hear Silicon Valley talking about all the time is, for many of us who've spent time there, we know it's not just a myth. It is, in fact, what happens there. And for Intel, there'd been a number of lessons I had learned, but one of them I had learned was that there was a new wave of technology coming, and we didn't have necessarily the skills, the tools, or as far as I was concerned, the critical questions to really tackle that technology. And it had been coming for a while. It had come under a number of different guises. It had been called big data. It had been called the Internet of Things, or IoT. It was being rebadged as AI ago. And I was really interested in thinking about, were there other ways of approaching that problem? And so when Brian said it's time to come home, my question to him was, well, it was less a question, I think, and more a statement. It was, if I'd wanted to be a professor, I would already have done it. I don't. I have no ambitions in my life to be a professor. It's not where I find I am most useful. I want to build things. And he's like, what does that mean? I don't know yet. I need to go away and think about it. And eventually I came back to Brian and I said, okay, listen, here's the thing. I think in order to manage AI in a way that we're not managing it currently, we need to do something different. And he's like, what does that mean? I was like, well, I think much the same way computers demanded computer science and steam engines required civil engineering, I think AI is going to require a new branch of engineering to take it safely, responsibly, and sustainably to scale. He went, okay. I'm like, right, you realize that what I'm saying is that I'm going to build a new branch of engineering at the Australian National University? He's like, yeah. I'm like, do you have anything to say to that? He's like, well, I'm sure you'd be quite busy. Okay. Like basically best endorsement ever. He's like, didn't doubt I could do it, just thought it'd be busy. And he was, of course, right. And so I came home with the help of Adrian Turner and Larry Marshall at Cyro and Data 61, respectively, and the help of Brian. And I suspect many things that Advance was doing in the background. We started a small institute. So basically imagine a startup inside a university. For those of you who have run startups, backed startups, or are still in startups, you know this is an insane thing to do. Both the startup piece, but the startup in a university piece, because effectively you are now attempting to do a really hard thing inside a place that doesn't know how to think about things that move quickly and break stuff. Which meant the first conversation was me saying, I think I'd only like to have 5 years worth of funding and I need some stage gates. And the university said, what does that mean? I'm like, well, if I don't get through the first stage gate, you should take away my money. And they're like, well, what would you do then? I'm like, something else. They said, we have no idea how to make that happen. I'm like, okay. So we had a patient explanation about what a stage gate was, why you might need one, how to think about fiscal responsibility and discipline, why you might want to scope things in sort of stages. And so we pushed play on September 1st, now 2017. 5 years, plus or minus one, a tiny amount of money with the commitment I would go find more, and me. That was it. No staff, just me. And I accumulated a collection of people relatively quickly. I decided that the way to build a new branch of engineering was to do three things. One was to go back and see what lessons you could learn from history about people who'd done this before. I knew I wasn't the first person to do it, and I knew some people have failed. See, in some ways, the failure to get information sciences to scale, the failure to get cybernetics to scale, see the successes, computer science, civil engineering, electrical engineering. So go mine a little bit of history and work out what worked and what didn't. And then I figured it was really simple, just kind of naivety you can have when you're amped up on a lot of coffee and being kept awake by Australian cockatoos. I was like, right, we'll do three things. We will teach it into existence, we will study it into existence, and we'll theorize it. And my kind of principle was, in trying to teach something, you get really clear about what the pieces are. I wanted to go study people that were already taking AI to scale and see where their challenges had been. And then I wanted to think, what were the big questions you would need to ask about that? And I truthfully thought we'd do it in the reverse order. I thought we'd theorize, study, and teach. And about 6 months into that journey, it was clear to me that some stuff was happening in the US, particularly at MIT and Stanford, and that if we wanted to keep Australia competitive in this conversation, we couldn't wait for teaching. We actually had to go early and go hard. And so we put together an educational curriculum ahead of any of the big universities in the US or Europe and decided to just do something insane, like more insane. I think at this point, the Vice Chancellor was very tired of seeing me in his office because I turned up and said, right, I think I want to have a course. He's like, it takes 18 months. I'm like, why? He's like, well, there's a process. I'm like, well, does the process take 18 months? He's like, well, no, it's 3 meetings. I said, we could do it in 10 weeks. He just laughed, but no. So we did it in 8. We created a new course. We created a new master's program. And between the moment I conceived of the project until we had our first recruiting round was 80 days. And it was 100 before we had our first students. I was incredibly lucky in doing that. We didn't have any backing from the university. We just used social media. So I put out a request on Twitter and said, I am building a new branch of engineering. It doesn't have a name. I have a new program. That doesn't have a name. You should come to Canberra. That does have a name, but that may not be an incentive. Go. We got 174 applicants. So one of them turned out to be a duplicate. So we got 173 applicants in total, 50% female, which was extraordinary. It was the largest number of women, both as a raw number and as a percentage of an applicant pool that has ever been seen in engineering at the Australian National University. They came from all over the world. They came from all over the disciplinary map, literally from astronomy all the way through to zoology. We had enough money at that point to fund 10. I was really committed to the notion that you wanted to bring people into the university that wouldn't get here otherwise. I was really committed to the notion that there should be equity of access. I really wanted to have people that were multiple places in their life journeys. So not just people who were fresh out of university, but people who had had other lives before they came to me. And I had enough money at that point for 10. When I looked at the applicant pool, I went, oh shit, there's no way I can restrict it to that. So I went back to Brian and basically said, write me an IOU. I'm good for it. Can I take a few more? We ended up taking 16. I remember making 16 phone calls, starting in the early afternoon and calling all over the world, because I was calling all over the world. 16 calls in a row. I had one person hang up on me, swearing profusely, and then called me back 5 minutes later to apologize because he was in the middle of the office and he hadn't realized that he was ever going to get in, and this changed his entire life. He said some very rude words inside the treasurer's department. I think his career has recovered. I had a soldier who just said, yes, ma'am, and hung up. I had someone say to me, it's the middle of the night here and I'm asleep, so I'm sure I'm dreaming, but if you send me an email and it's still there in the morning, I know I'll say yes because I won't have made it up. I had 2 people burst into tears, both of them men, and I had one person say no. And I called her back a week later and said, have you changed your mind yet? And she said, oh, thank God you called. I didn't know how to change my mind. Please take me. And so we ended up with 16 students. They ranged in age from 25 to 60. They had backgrounds in everything from computer science and electrical engineering and mathematics to theatre, fine arts, architecture, psychology. They had been, by the time they came to me, everything from maths teachers to running theatre groups to trained members of the Australian military and someone in the diplomatic corps. And over that first year, which was only last year, 2019, we ran an experimental education program. 3 things, which for me are the 3 things that you need to do in education. It was something that I think I crassly started to call my hearts, heads and hands policy, was that we taught them a course that was a year-long building blocks course. So how do you give people the building blocks to encounter AI systems? So everyone learned to code. Everyone learned to think about data visualizations and algorithms. Everyone learned a little bit of AI. Everyone also learned how to build physical stuff, because code is one thing, but making code move physical things is something completely different. I reckon I'm still the only lab on campus that has both a sewing machine and a 3D printer. I want an arc welder, but they won't let me have one in the building. They're very mean. We taught them how to basically build shit. Like, it's not just enough to code, you've got to build. And the contrast between those 2 things of how code makes building things work is really important. And for me, it was never about making people into computer scientists or into engineers. It was about giving people the vocabulary and the capacity to talk to engineers and computer scientists and ask them questions in their own framework, effectively. I'm of a vintage where I'm old enough to have learnt to code in high school and university. I learnt Pascal. You don't use that terribly often anymore, but I know the architecture of the computer programming language and I know how to think about it. And it means having that capacity lets me have conversations across disciplines that would be hard if you didn't. So a hands piece of the curriculum. There was a head piece of the curriculum, which was we gave everyone the same building blocks across critical thinking disciplines. So as much as you need to be able to code and build stuff, you also need to be able to ask about code and building stuff. So the locus of that piece, the genesis there, was to get people from thinking about problem solving to question framing. I'm sure many of us in our careers have realized we've gotten to a moment where we're being asked to solve a problem and you think that is just so wrong-headed. It's totally not the right problem. It's the wrong question that got you to thinking that was the problem you needed to solve. And I want to take about 7 steps back up the pipe. So we wanted to equip our students with the capacity to ask good questions, which means thinking about all the disciplines that are question disciplines. So the social sciences, the humanities, law, policy, the sciences, all have ways of asking questions and critically interrogating stuff. So whether it's asking where did it come from, what's its history, what are the people who built it, what were they thinking, what is its context, what is the legal framework. Parenthetically, we had a conversation with my students because they're back in the classroom today about COVID-19, and as half of my current cohort is from overseas, we had to have a conversation about Australian law and about why there's a different relationship between state and federal law, what it means to be in the ACT, what it means to think about, all the various pieces, because that whole context is necessary for understanding the moment they find themselves in. So hands, heads, and then for me, the heart piece was you actually have to have a reason for doing it. You've got to be engaged with the notion that you want to build something better than the place we find ourselves. So part of our recruit for that cohort and for all of our faculty and staff has always been about whether you are mission driven, whether you are someone who is invested not just in teams, but in the success of others, and whether you're interested in basically collaborative spaces. So we wanted to build all those practices into it. So a building class, a questions and framing course, and then a capstone. So we send all of our students out into the world too, because I don't think it's enough to keep people locked in the university. I think you have to send them out to pragmatically do things. Short, long story, and that is a long story. Long story short, we graduated those students 10 days ago. My first cohort went live into the world, which is amazing. Equally amazing, I know. Equally amazing, all 16 who started finished, which is extraordinary. Also unheard of at the university. We lose them usually in a kind of, Oscar Wilde meets Bernard Shaw kind of way, which isn't good. So we kept all 16. In the meantime, we recruited another cohort, so they are with us now. They are even more globally diverse. They're still 50% female. We have our first Indigenous student, which is extraordinary. First Indigenous student, near as I can tell, in the history of the college, which is worrying, but working as best we can on that. And we are now with a live recruit for cohort 3. So at some point here, Maria might flash up, if I can find it, the URL for the institute. So I think it's just at the moment, if you just go to 3ainstitute.org, we have a live recruit for our next cohort. And I would love anyone that you can think of who thinks they might need to be there. If you could push them our way, that would be great. And then as of today, oh my God, we've also launched our first PhD program. So we took, for a bunch of students who turn up going, I never thought I was going to go to graduate school. A bunch of them went, can we get PhDs too? I'm like, you are suckers for punishment. So we, of course, we said yes. So we took 5 of those students and they start today with, again, an experimental PhD program. So some of us on the call got our PhDs in other places. Sarah, I'm looking at you. And I know that we have other experiences of PhDs. So I'm trying to bring some of the American experience here. So cohort-based and a little bit of in classroom. So not just basically, in some ways, the Australian PhD system, which in the sciences feels a bit like a form of ritual abandonment. I thought we might bring people in and make them spend time with each other and also do some co-learning before we send them off to go do their own projects. So that's kicked off too. So long story short, Institute is 3 years in. We now have a macro credentialing program, so we know how to think about a master's education, a PhD. We're working out what undergraduate would look like. In the meantime, we're also working on how you deliver educational experiences outside of the university, because for me, it's not enough to just lock it all up here. You want to share. We've continued to do research, and we've continued to kind of think about what are the big questions that animate these systems. In that process, the other thing that's become really clear to me is that, and I think, Yasmin, this is where I'd want to end, is that it's really clear to me in building all of this that there are some critical questions we should be asking at a national level, not just at a local level. So for me, the thing I knew I could most do, frankly, for my country and for the world, was to work out how to build this branch of engineering, because the AI technology is here. I mean, it's literally already here. It won't turn up in the form of the Terminator or pick your favorite science fiction movie. It will turn up in the form of AI-enabled lifts in the Barangaroo Towers and every other building in Sydney that has more than 10 stories. Those lifts are already running an AI stack. It will turn up in the public transportation system that bisects Canberra. It will turn up in the gates that Qantas has in LAX, where your face opens your access to the aeroplane. And one day, Yasmin, I hope we will be traveling again and we will encounter those gates. AI is already in all those places. So this is not a matter of a future that's somewhere out there. This is a future that's already happening, and making sure we are asking the right questions of that and skilled up to handle it means people like my students, right, who are equipped to start asking questions about what will that world look like. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. I can deliver those students to the world, and we'll continue to do so. And hopefully within a few years here, we will have developed a curriculum stable enough that we will send it off to everyone else, and other people will do it too. But in the meantime, as we think about what it means not just to equip the next cohort to build those systems, I actually think there's a series of questions we need to be asking at a national level about what it will take to have an AI-ready society. And so at the beginning of this year, in response to a request by the Prime Minister and Karen Andrews, so the Minister for Innovation, I put together a proposal for what it would take for Australia to be an AI-ready society. And I thought there were 6 key attributes we needed to be thinking of in order to make that happen. And they have different kind of pieces, right? First piece was I thought you needed to have a sustainable approach. And the reason I had been thinking that is that one of the secrets about artificial intelligence and next generation technical systems that we don't discuss terribly often in public is how much energy they require. So at this point, 2020, about 10%, maybe 11% of the world's entire energy budget is spent just keeping data. So that's what powers server farms. That's what powers every app you are using. That's what makes them function. And 10% of the entire world energy budget. So like whole country's worth, basically. And that 10% is a floor, not a ceiling. And while companies like Intel and others, Microsoft most obviously, talk about energy savings moving forward with their technical systems, they are also talking about an increased density of technical systems. And so as you have that confluence, more technology and more density, even as they become more energy efficient, you don't necessarily diminish the overall energy budget. And that's particularly true of things like the 5G conversion. So the first full scale city deployments of 5G, we saw an increase in the number of base stations by 5x. Basically, Boston's the one I know best. It went from 4,000 to 16,000 or 20,000 base stations. Each one of those base stations has gone from being a dumb terminal to running a full server stack. So now imagine that the future that we're talking about is going to cost us a whole lot of energy. So there are some questions we ought to be asking about both how do we require it to be done in a sustainable manner? What are the requests we would be making of the commercial enterprises that are doing this? What would we set as standards at a governmental level about this, particularly against the backdrop of the last summer? Frankly, in Australia, I know it's easy to forget, but before the pandemic, over 80% of the Australian population had been touched in some way by the bushfires of the summer of 2019 to 2020. And I think for many Australians, we were much more acutely aware of both the vulnerability of our infrastructures, but also the need for a more and different approach. So what would be a sustainability approach, both just to the energy need, but also to all the component pieces that go into AI, require all kinds of things that actually have to come out of what we now realize is a fairly complicated supply chain that doesn't always function as effectively as we would like. So number one, you need to have a sustainable approach for an AI-ready society. Number two is you actually need to find ways to bring society along on that journey. So how we think about what it means to be an engaged society in that sense, which is everything from how do we think about different notions of being focused to different notions about bringing people along in terms of the stories we tell, about the nature and notion of our civic and civil society. So how do we think about things like trust? How do we think about things like what it means to talk about fake news, even as a category? What it means to think about how we worry about citizenship and participation, how you bring along everyone equally. So an engaged society there, hugely important, which also means how would we think about what are Australian values in these stories, not just American ones? I would think one of the things that's been most clear about the arc of the pandemic so far is that while there are many ways that Australia is like the United States, there are some key ways in which we aren't. We still have ideas about society over the individual. And some of the most troubling aspects, I think, for many Australians about the last month or so has been how we square the notion of community responsibility and individual sensibility. And Australia historically has been a more community-oriented country and culture. And we have completely different ideas about equity of access than Americans. And so thinking about how would we build our own value set into things and how would we think about policing, that's actually kind of an interesting question. And I noted with some interest today that the New Zealand government has put out the first set of standards for algorithms to have them comport to New Zealand values. So this is not an undoable thing, and I don't think it necessarily slows down innovation. I just think it raises a way where we can think about some really different questions. So sustainable, engaged, I think you have to have a focus on learning, which means across the entire society. This doesn't just mean the usual thing where we say, kids need to learn to code. You're like, well, that's nice. Turns out most of Australian society is not in primary school or high school. Most of us aren't. We're actually somewhere else. So how do we think about lifelong learning? How do we think about an approach to lifelong exposure to different ways of thinking? How do we ensure that a learning focus is also an important component of our regulatory and political classes? As Yasmin mentioned, I am a NED on a board for an Australian company. There's a series of requirements about being a NED that require you being financially literate. There is an argument we could make about making our politicians be technically literate. It would be nice to have them be able to explain various kinds of technology in manners that are, well, plausible. So what it means to think about having a learning focus throughout life and an adaptive one where we don't get wed to saying you need to learn this coding format or this particular structure, but how do we ensure that there is a focus on learning and upskilling. And we've already seen government investment in that. That's certainly where you'd look at some of the TN announcements over the last couple of months have been very much about what does it mean to think about skilling and to start thinking about things like grad certs, a reassertion of the importance of TAFEs, but also how we actually say these are things that we need to engage with in multiple kind of sectors and how do we bring multiple people along on that journey. It's really clear that whatever you do here can't just be about AI in business and in business in the sense of technical companies. I mean, here I'm thinking about people like, well, some of the big American kind of CEOs of the last 5 years who basically would say things like, everyone got through the 20th century without being a tech company. No one gets through the 21st century without being a data and AI company. But it turns out that where AI will be in our societies isn't just about efficiencies and productivities. It's also about how you would have an AI-ready society that was inclusive of some of the sectors that have been hardest hit over the last 3 months. So the arts and the creative and the entertainment through sports sectors. So all the places where we actually know that technological innovation has been a really big thing. We don't often celebrate it in Australia, but the work of everything from our mainstream media outlets to our government-sponsored media outlets to the ways in which we've supported the arts in Australia have created incredibly important engines for growth in Australia and beyond. And how we think about what it means to have a vibrant creative sector as part and parcel of an AI-ready society feels to me to be a really important question. And here I look to things that were being done before the pandemic in places like the Queensland Ballet, who've been thinking about how to integrate drones into performance pieces. Or I look at my friends and colleagues in the Royal Shakespeare, in the UK, who've been working out how to use virtual reality to put the Tempest into a house in Stratford and make it into basically a haunted accumulative narrative. And to the work they're doing on the future of the audience and thinking really in fascinating ways about what it means to build new technologies, not just to deliver productivity, but to tell stories. And after all, most important technology of the 20th century, one that most human beings don't think of as being a technology, probably the biggest game changer, might well have been the television. So how we think about, dominant technical platforms and where we want to have them is, for me, part and parcel of what an AI-ready society would be. And the two kind of last pieces, one is around what it would mean to have a balanced regulatory framework. I know there's always that kind of story that gets told, well, if you have regulation, you don't have innovation. And I think that's an interesting furphy, and one might want to think critically about why we tell that story. We certainly know that regulation has been a necessary part of maintaining health. It's why we regulate medical technologies. It's why we regulate biosecurity at the border to ensure the well-being of certain kinds of ecosystems. Those have not necessarily slowed down innovation. They've made things safer. You can certainly look to multiple European countries. Germany would be the obvious one, and say actually an enormous regulatory framework has not necessarily slowed down innovation at all. It has just created different innovation pipelines. And thinking here about how you balance standards, policy, and regulation, as well as other organizations that should be in that conversation, feels to me an important thing. And then last but by no means least, I think there's a really interesting set of questions to ask, and they feel very particular at the moment, about how we talk about economics and how we think about the measure of a good society. It would be easy if you were an archaeologist digging up the 21st century to think that the only way people understood societies was by GDP, that there was like a single metric and that was what was written on every building, like the GDP of this building. And the reality, of course, is economics is one measure of society, but there are many others. And so how we think about what it means to have a healthy society and where AI sits in all of that may not necessarily mean constantly talking about GDP as the only indicator. And I'm acutely aware in this moment in time where we are having a conversation about population health versus economic stability and sustainability, that we're already in some ways trapped inside that cycle, and how we think about unpicking and unpacking that a little bit, where we understand those are not binary choices, but something slightly more nuanced feels important. So I know that's a long-winded list, Yasmin, but for me, thinking about what it means to do innovation at scale, at a national scale, means paying attention to all of those pieces, about what it means to do it sustainably, about what it means to do it in a balanced regulatory way, about what it means to not trade off commercial versus the arts and the creative sectors, about not effectively thinking that it's all about the business, but also remembering that you have to have a civic and civil discourse around those pieces and what it means to bring people along on that journey, feel to me like those are all the things we ought to be thinking about. So with that, I'm going to stop, I think, and see if we can have a bit of a conversation, because I realize I have been talking continuously for a really long time. And you've been staring over my shoulder and going, good God, that woman has the Cookie Monster in her house. Yeah, exactly.
You've done exactly what we hoped you would do. Good hello, everyone, whether you're in Australia, Japan, the UK, or around Australia, or Australia, Japan, UK, and the United States. My name is Maria McNamara, and I'm the CEO of advance.org. And I cannot tell you how excited I am, although you would have seen me nodding all the way through that presentation, to have the marvellous Genevieve Bell amongst us. It's a shame we've only got an hour and a half for today's conversation, because I think there's at least a lifetime worth of ideas to unlock. I'm looking forward to this being the very first of many visits by you, Genevieve, into the advance.org series. You've made it very personal, whether it's the storytelling, whether it's the story you began with, where you put us in country with your mother, raising you and your brother amongst Indigenous communities, or the journey that you've taken us on through the United States and back home. I'm very grateful to Brian Schmidt for asking you to come home, because now more than ever, we need you here. The introductory remarks are about unveiled opportunities that augur well for this economy and this society, particularly for organisations that are established, ones that are growing fast, and ones that are yet to be developed. When I chose this topic above the others that you so kindly offered us, it was because there was an overwhelming desire to trigger a more robust, a more informed and an active conversation about the time, the need and the push to build new things, particularly in the midst of the angst created by the economic malaise that we had, the drought, the bushfires, the floods, the hailstorms, all these things that preceded the global pandemic. If the world and the earth isn't sending us some strong signal then to try something new, I don't know what is.